if Bakhmut falls and if the offensive really begins to take off, you might see a shuffle. We've seen military shuffles before, and so a political shuffle, maybe you see something like that. Um, we'll just have to see. We'll have to see. I personally think Prigozhin is not out of the fight. He's all political. He's a political animal, and I think he is. I think he's going to be in there sniffing around as well. And so Putin's going to have to watch Prigozhin over his shoulder, as well as others, I'm sure, that are out there waiting on something that to happen that would really show Putin in terms of being weak and vulnerable. I'm certain there's vultures circling over his head. I think he knows that too. So if something like Bakhmut happens, which I would imagine we'll see what he does in response, so that he doesn't look like he's not a man of action. Well, I think we'll see more of these kinds of attacks originating in Ukraine and going for targets deeper into Russia. Uh, in a sense, it's a psychological operation. These drone attacks are not as massive, certainly, as the attacks that the Russians are perpetrating on Ukraine. The targets are not civilian targets in Russia, but it's really a message from Zelensky and from Ukraine that we're taking the war to Russia. They need to feel at least somewhat vulnerable to attacks from Ukraine. They'll not never reach the scale of what the Ukrainians are having to deal with, but this is just a tapping on the shoulder of the common Russian in the street, saying, "Look, you're in a war now with us, and you might not see it over your skies every day, but we want you to feel vulnerable. You need to know what's happening to us, what your country is doing to us."
We're also seeing these Ukrainian drone attacks on Crimea a lot closer to the front line of the war. Do you think this is intended to have more of a strategic impact compared to the attacks we've seen in Russia, or is it more of a morale impact?
Well, it's certainly a strategic impact in the sense of the battlefield, because in Crimea is where you have a lot of the warehouses and troop consolidations and things that are going on to support the Russian war in the east of Ukraine. That's a big place for the Russians in terms of logistics. So the attacks into Crimea certainly will have a morale impact on those that live in Crimea, but it's really much more trying to get at the war making capability of the Russians there in the east. And they're having an impact, and that's what will support this offensive that Ukraine is perpetrating in the area, is to hit the rear areas of Russia, the command and control centers that are there in Crimea, as I said, the logistics, the artillery concentrations, or the certainly the ammunition and all the kinds of war-making kit that you need, that the Russians need, and so the Ukrainians are going after that. But the attacks in Russia, that's strategic as well at a higher level. It does impact morale. As I said, it's a psyops, or a psychological impact in terms of the Russian people. So that's that. Those attacks into Russia do have that impact as well. But the Crimea impact is, while being strategic, it's more strategic on a military basis in terms of impacting those enablers for the Russian offensive in Ukraine.
We've also seen these strikes today in both Ukrainian and Russian controlled areas, with several people being killed in Kyiv near Kherson. We've seen Ukraine's capability to defend major cities like Kyiv has sort of massively improved since the war has started. Do you think there's more equipment or training that could be sent to Ukraine to kind of prevent these deaths from airstrikes?
Well, I think we're seeing a broadening of the target area by the Russians, including particularly Odessa, as they try to impact Ukraine's ability to send food abroad. And so I think we're going to see a growing requirement for air defense, such as Patriot and other kinds of air defense that the Allies have been providing as well. We're going to see more need of that in the south, in the Odessa area. I think so. Generally, we're gonna see that as an impact in the coming months. But I think one thing you can say is that they will need a constant stream of ammunition for Patriot, for air defense. They're using a lot of it, and it's got to be replaced. It's not good enough just to have the system if you don't have a stream of supply that you can depend on. And so that is just critical in terms of air defense. And also with the offensive going, there's other needs as well that have to be paid attention to, and I think the Allies are, and that's certainly ammunition for the artillery. Ukraine has been using HIMARS and other kinds of multiple launch rocket systems, as well as towed artillery that fires, shells or those kinds of munitions need to be constantly up, kept up because of the rate of fire that the Ukrainians are putting on to the Russians, to good effect, by the way. I think this offensive is beginning to really get some traction now because they've been able to really get at the Russian artillery, and that's what Russia has traditionally always depended on in the battlefield is heavy concentrations of artillery, and that's been thinned out by Ukraine, and but it takes ammunition to do that, and the burn rate is significant for Ukraine, so that's got to continue as well. But you got to add to that list of needs air defense down in the south.
The head of Ukraine's presidential office, Andriy Yermak, has said that negotiations could be restarted, possibly in Saudi Arabia, to end the war in Ukraine, but that Russia might not be invited to those. Without more progress in the counteroffensive, what sort of peace would Ukraine be seeking?
Well, I think Ukraine certainly needs to keep all lines open. Their top priority is kicking the Russians out of Ukraine. But I think at the same time they're demonstrating that they're open to discussions. They're demonstrating that the Russians are not. The Russians instead, I think they just passed a law over the past couple of days enabling more of a mobilization of young Russian men to go to the front after being trained somewhat, and who knows if they're even armed. But it looks like Putin is doubling down. He's not looking for an off ramp, as we say. He's not looking for a way out. He doesn't feel cornered. He's doubling down. He thinks he's going to win. He thinks that the West will eventually grow tired of this. Good for the Saudis to try to broker something. China has tried, certainly the West early on. But both sides have to be interested in it. Russia is not. Russia has no signals at all that they feel they need to. And Ukraine, I think, by saying, sure, we'll talk, I mean, they're just demonstrating that they're willing, but they're showing that Russia is not. So, talk is important, but right now there's a fight to be had, and I think that's what both sides are looking at doing.
Ukraine has said that the war won't be finished unless they retake Crimea and the Donbass. But how can Ukrainian forces, and indeed Ukraine as a country, survive this kind of continued summer and possibly even winter of warfare?
Well, that's what Putin is asking as well, and his bet is that they won't survive another winter, that they will eventually have sponsors that are no longer interested in supplying them, i.e., the West. His assumptions are absolutely wrong. He's made lots of assumptions that have proven wrong over the past year, and I think he's still going down that path. I think he cannot believe that Ukraine will continue fighting, and he cannot believe that the West, and particularly the United States, will continue to support Ukraine. And the West has given him plenty of reasons to assume that we won't. I mean, if you look at Kabul, I mean, there's a lot of examples where the West grew tired of this, and he's assuming that's going to be the case here. There's political voices in the United States and elsewhere that embolden him along those lines. So he's going to double down, and so I think that we're gonna find ourselves in a place where the winter will be upon us. But I think Ukraine is better equipped now for that winter, and Western Europe as well. As you remember, last winter there was a lot of expectations of terrible suffering. Not that there wasn't suffering, but it certainly wasn't as bad as some expected. The winter was a bit milder than the one coming up could be. But I also understand that Ukraine has been building up its capacity now in terms of gas reserves, in terms of its electrical grid. It's learned a lot from last year. I'm sure the Russians have as well. So we'll have to see what happens. But for sure, the assumptions by Putin is that they're not going to be able to take another year of this. I feel certain he's wrong on that. The Allies have said that. The West has said that. Ukraine seems as determined as ever, and we'll see where this offensive takes us. In terms of Crimea and the Donbass and how far does Ukraine want to go, etc. We'll have to see. The battlefield is going to dictate a lot of that. But so will the West. And I think right now the West is determined to stick by Ukraine. And I think that this offensive might show the Russians that, their assumptions about Ukraine's ability to kick them out of Ukraine, that their assumptions might be wrong about how capable Ukraine is of doing that.
And as you say, far from sort of seeking peace, it seems that President Putin is aiming to expand the capabilities of his campaign by extending the age of conscription in Russia up to 30. What sort of impact do you think this can have in Ukraine on the battlefield? But perhaps more importantly, what sort of impact is it going to have at home in Russia for Putin?
Well, I think at home, that wouldn't surprise Ukraine. And I think Ukraine probably is saying, bring it on. I think we've seen in the past that the call ups that have happened over the last year have resulted not in well trained well trained Russian youth that have come in, well armed, trained, morale high, determined to defeat the Nazis in Ukraine and all of that. I don't think that's been the rule that we have certainly seen. And I think Russian young men who are sent down to Ukraine probably don't believe the propaganda that they're out there to get Nazis. I think there's enough that is out there among the Russian people to show that goal or that explanation by Putin has proven to be absolutely wrong. And so I think we're gonna if this in fact is going to result in more call-ups, which it sounds like it will, of older Ukraine men who might have a much more to lose in terms of going down and fighting in a war. They have families or businesses potentially or other things to lose. Um, that will be certainly something that will keep them from developing too much of a war fervor, especially if they're trained for 2 weeks, given an old AK-47 and sent to the front line. Older men are not going to be as gung-ho, and so I think for Ukraine, I don't think this is going to have them shaking in their boots. But I think it does remind them that there are more Russians than there are Ukrainians, and they have got to get a move on in terms of taking back and consolidating their victory so far. And their own call-ups in Ukraine too. There's a need for that to continue. So they're not going to sit back and be complacent. But I don't think that a new Russian horde is going to result in too much in terms of a battlefield.
Also seen from Medvedev, who is deputy head of Russia's Security Council, that Russia would be forced to use nuclear weapons if Ukraine took back a lot of this land that Russia now claims has been annexed through referendums. We've heard these threats from Russia before, though. How seriously should Ukraine and the West take them?
Well, I think we should always take them seriously. But you're right. We've heard this before. We've heard it from a number of sources over the past year or so. But, the Russians have heard from the West as well and from China saying that's not a good idea. Russia isn't under threat of extinction. Russia hasn't been invaded. As much as I might want to cook the books into making it seem like if the Donbass is invaded, that's Russia. It doesn't give a battlefield advantage to Russia to use nuclear weapons either. So we've heard this before, but it reminds us that is always in the background. And I would imagine word is getting to Medvedev and others. Bill Burns is usually our conduit, the head of the CIA and in the United States, and then probably China saying, you're starting to go there. in your rhetoric, and pointing out that this is something that is not good for China, not good for Russia, and not good for Europe either. So let's see if we don't see a number of interlocutors start talking to the Russians about using this kind of rhetoric.
How much influence do you think China has on Russia on the world stage when it comes to this war?
Oh, a lot of influence. Russia depends on China for many things. Microchips being one of them. You know, in terms of helping the Russians to regenerate their military capability. Uh, I think you could say that China is the only friend that Russia seems to have that has any clout, of course. But that friendship only goes so far. These aren't two mates, that have grown up together and gone through life. This is a marriage of convenience in a lot of ways. I think China wants to promote this third way of global governance, if you will. That it's not just the West. It's not just the liberal world order and all that we like to talk about, that there's another way, and China represents that. And I guess they consider Russia representing that as well. And so they like having another voice out there pushing back on the West. But that voice becomes weakened by Russia when they do things like invade another country or use a nuclear weapon. And not only that, but it's bad for Chinese business. China still does a lot of business in Europe and in the United States too. This it's a very it's a woven tapestry of economic relations between the West, the United States, and China. The Chinese economy isn't doing so well. Still coming out of the COVID shutdown. The other elements of their economy has been thrown off. So the last thing in the world they want to have happen is to go down with the ship should Russia start leaking and listing and going under. So they have to play it very carefully. Yeah, China definitely has a lot of influence in Moscow. Russia certainly is the junior partner when it comes to those two, and I think that China can be an influence on Russia to do the right thing, but for all the wrong reasons.
So bringing it back to Europe a bit, Poland, we're hearing, is continuing to send troops and material to its border with Belarus after warnings that the Wagner troops stationed there might be preparing attacks on Poland. Is this likely, and what sort of response could this trigger from NATO?
Well, I don't think this likely that that Poland will be attacked. And Poland, of course, is in NATO. The Article 5 security guarantee in the North Atlantic Treaty will certainly be invoked should Poland be attacked by Wagner troops. But I think we have to look at the facts as much as we can tell in terms of just what are we talking about in terms of Wagner, in terms of Belarus. Uh, First, in terms of Belarus, the Belarusian soldier is not exactly the warrior that people might think they are. There have been morale problems in the army there in Belarus. They're not thrilled at all about the war that's going on between Ukraine and Russia. They don't want to be pulled into it in terms of the Belarusian military. The idea that the Wagner mercenaries can train them up to be Wagner-like soldiers is just wrong. The Wagner soldier is a former prisoner or a mercenary. They're not a trained, skilled, Western style warrior force. They are a bunch of mercenaries, and their reputation has been built up in the media and among because of propaganda. Among the Russian people as well. They've got this strange relationship with Belarus. We're not even sure how many Wagner forces are there. I heard a figure of 8,000 a while ago. Well, 8,000 Wagner troops, along with some very reluctant Belarusians, are not going to be able to invade Poland and then spark a war with NATO that they're going to win. That's just not going to happen. So I think what we're really seeing is, at most, it's a diversionary kind of thing where Putin and Prigozhin, I guess, and the Belarusian government, they're trying to make it sound like a big threat over against either Poland or Ukraine to divert Ukraine forces from the east to the west. Maybe they're trying to Wagner and Prigozhin are trying to burnish their image as far as being warriors, and that they're not in trouble for almost sparking a coup. I think maybe Putin is trying to keep them busy. You guys go to Belarus, you just march around, you threaten Ukraine, you be a diversion, it's just something along those lines. So I don't think the Poles and I don't think the Ukrainians are looking on this as a threat that they can't defeat. I don't. I think that Poland, particularly, has to take this seriously because we've been surprised before, and you don't sit back and just assume away a threat. So Poland is doing all the right things, I know, to deter something there, and NATO will do that as well. But I think what we're really looking at is just get some games being played there in Belarus, and that I don't think we're going to see Wagner forces crossing into Ukraine at the head of a big Belarusian army driving towards Kyiv. The Russians tried that, and look what happened. I'm not sure Wagner's going to do much better, but I don't want to sit here and mock them. We have to take it seriously. Everyone's keeping an eye on them, and we'll just see what happens. But time will have to tell on this one.
And what do you make of this chaos among Putin's generals following that Wagner mutiny? We had Mark Galeotti on previously, who said we might see a reshuffle in the Kremlin. Do you think that's likely?
Well, we certainly could. I think if there is a big Bakhmut, is going to probably fall to the Ukrainians. I think in the next few days, and that will be seen as a big psychological blow to Putin himself personally, as well as to Russia, and maybe as a result of that, you might see a reshuffle. I think you wouldn't necessarily see a reshuffle because of Wagner and Prigozhin and their mutiny of a few weeks ago. You don't want to. I don't think Putin wants to show that resulted in anything. And that's why he kept on the Russian high command. He didn't do anything. So, but if Bakhmut falls and if the offensive really begins to take off, you might see a shuffle. We've seen military shuffles before, and so a political shuffle, maybe you see something like that. Um, we'll just have to see. We'll have to see. I personally think Prigozhin is not out of the fight. He's all political. He's a political animal, and I think he is. I think he's going to be in there sniffing around as well. And so Putin's going to have to watch Prigozhin over his shoulder, as well as others, I'm sure, that are out there waiting on something that to happen that would really show Putin in terms of being weak and vulnerable. I'm certain there's vultures circling over his head. I think he knows that too. So if something like Bakhmut happens, which I would imagine we'll see what he does in response, so that he doesn't look like he's not a man of action. We just have to see.
Jim Townsend, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.